No one in that airplane trusted him. Not the pilots, not the gunners, not even the men who would soon owe their lives to him. If the aircraft went down, they believed he would be the first to jump. If the mission went wrong, they believed he would freeze. Because that's who Maynard Smith had always been. This was not a man chosen for courage. This was a man tolerated out of necessity. 32 years old, short, thin, already graying, his staff sergeant with no combat experience and a reputation so bad that crews avoided him even during a war that was killing men by the thousands. In a world where teamwork meant survival, Maynard Smith was the one variable no one wanted, and yet fate had decided something else. Long before fire tore through metal and long before bullets stitched holes through aluminum, Maynard Smith had been practicing for failure his entire life. He grew up comfortable, not rich enough to be careless, but secure enough to be entitled. His father was respected. His mother was educated in a small American town. That meant doors opened easily. Maynard learned early that rules bent if you pushed hard enough. Teachers complained. Neighbors whispered. Authority figures grew tired. But consequences never landed where they should have. When his behavior became impossible to manage, his parents sent him away. Believing discipline could be outsourced. A military academy, uniforms, routines, orders. The kind of place meant to straighten boys like him. It didn't. He learned how to perform obedience without believing in it. He learned how to survive systems while quietly resenting them. He learned that effort could be simulated and responsibility delayed. Those lessons followed him. Into adulthood, he drifted from job to job. Government offices, financial agencies, desks that demanded punctuality and patience. He despised them all, not because they were unfair, because they required consistency. He married, he divorced, he moved on without reflection. Then his father died, and with that death came money. Enough money to avoid urgency. Enough money to postpone adulthood. Enough money to convince Maynard Smith that he was smarter than the world trying to correct him. 4 years, he lived without purpose, no structure, no obligation. Just inheritance checks and self-justification until the money began to disappear, and when it did, reality didn't knock. It kicked the door in. By 1942, Maynard Smith wasn't just irresponsible. He was cornered. Legal pressure, missed obligations, a judge staring at a man who had run out of excuses. The offer was simple: prison. Or the military. There was no speech about duty. No sudden awakening of patriotism. Maynard Smith chose the uniform because it kept him out of a cell. The Army Air Forces didn't know what they were getting. Or maybe they did, and they simply didn't have the luxury of being picky anymore. Europe was burning. Bombers were falling from the sky. Crews were being destroyed faster than replacements could arrive. And one of the deadliest jobs in the war was desperate for volunteers. Aerial gunner, high risk, high casualties, slightly better pay. Maynard raised his hand immediately. Not for honor, not for courage, for the paycheck and the rank. He completed training just well enough to pass, just well enough to be sent overseas, just well enough to become someone else's problem. When he arrived in England, the reaction was immediate. Eyes rolled, voices dropped, names were whispered. He argued with superiors, showed up late, questioned orders, marked procedures, in a war where discipline kept men alive. Maynard Smith treated rules like suggestions. Crews noticed. Replacement gunners were usually absorbed quickly. Losses were constant. Experienced crews begged for extra hands. No one asked for him. Days passed, then weeks. Others flew missions. Others earned scars. Others didn't come back. Maynard Smith stayed on the ground. Not because the war didn't need him. Because the men flying into hell didn't trust him. They would rather fly short-handed than fly with a man they believed would fail when it mattered. And then, one night, the mission board changed everything. A name was written down. An aircraft was assigned. And the man nobody wanted found himself climbing toward the one place where excuses no longer mattered. High above the English Channel, inside a bomber that would soon be on fire, Maynard Smith was about to discover something terrifying. You can run from responsibility. You can avoid judgment. You can delay consequences. But sooner or later, life corners you. And when it does, it demands an answer. If this aircraft went down, history would never remember his name. The men round him didn't know it yet, but they were already flying inside a countdown. Every minute in the air was borrowed time. Every vibration in the metal skin of the bomber was a warning. And the man they trusted the least was sitting in the most dangerous position on the plane. The morning began in darkness. Engines coughed to life before sunrise, their deep rumble rolling across the airfield like distant thunder. Floodlights cut through mist and drizzle as ground crews moved quickly, silently. No jokes, no smiles. Everyone knew the target mattered. The mission board had gone up hours. Earlier, France, not just anywhere in France. A place layered in concrete, steel, guns. A place designed to survive bombing. A place that had already sent dozens of aircraft into the sea. Maynard Smith read the board twice, pretending not to care. His name was there. No escape. No delay. This was it. The crew he was. Assigned to had flown together for months. They knew each other's habits, voices, timing. They trusted instincts built through shared danger. He was the outsider, the rookie, the unwanted variable. No one said anything to him as they walked toward the aircraft. The silence was deliberate, the kind that reminds you exactly where you stand. The bomber waited at the end of the runway, massive and patient, its metal skin cold under gloved hands. To most men, it was protection. To others, a coffin that just hadn't closed yet. Maynard climbed aboard without ceremony. Inside, the aircraft smelled like oil, metal, and something sharper, fear that had soaked into the walls from previous missions. He moved through the narrow fuselage, careful not to meet anyone's eyes. His position was below them all, the ball turret, a glass and metal sphere hanging from the belly of the aircraft, exposed to sky and enemy fire, offering nowhere to run. To fit inside, you curled into yourself, knees tight, back hunched, head down. You didn't sit in it, you folded into it. When the aircraft lifted off, the vibration shook his bones. England disappeared beneath clouds. The sea followed, grey water stretching endlessly below. As altitude increased, the temperature dropped, breath fogged, fingers stiffened. The bomber climbed higher and higher until the world beneath it looked unreal. Up here, everything was quieter and more lethal for the first hours. Nothing happened. That was the worst part. The mind wandered. Doubt crept in. Time slowed. You listened to the engines and wondered which sound would change first when things went wrong. Maynard stayed quiet. He followed procedure. He did his job. No mistakes. No heroics. Not yet. When they reached the target, the sky erupted. Black bursts of flak bloomed round the formation, violent and sudden, punching holes through air and steel. The aircraft shuddered as shock waves rippled through it. This was the moment everyone feared. Bomb bay doors opened. The bomber steadied. The formation held. Then it was over. Bombs away. Turn for home. Relief moved through the crew like electricity. Shoulders loosened. Breathing slowed. They had survived the worst part. Also, they thought, cloud. Cover thickened as they headed north. Navigation became guesswork. Land blurred into sea. Sea blurred into cloud. Somewhere beneath them, a coastline appeared. Someone made a decision, and it was wrong. The aircraft descended, too low, too slow. The first explosion rocked the bomber so hard it felt like the sky had slammed shut. Flak tore. Into the fuselage. Metal screamed. Warning lights flared. Fuel lines ruptured. The smell of burning. Gasoline flooded the aircraft. Fire exploded behind Maynard's position. His turret lost power. The guns stopped moving. The intercom went silent. Smoke poured in. He was trapped. Below him, nothing but open air. Above him, a burning aircraft. For the first time in his life, Maynard Smith had nowhere to escape. He forced the hatch open and pulled himself upward into chaos. Flames raced along the walls. Ammunition cracked and popped as it cooked off in the heat. The aircraft groaned. Wounded but still flying, men screamed, then stopped. Somewhere. Boots thundered toward the exit. Parachutes snapped open. 3 figures vanished into cloudland. Water. The cockpit was cut off by fire. The tail gunner was bleeding, unmoving. And standing in the middle of it all was the man everyone believed would fail. The man nobody trusted. Maynard Smith inhaled smoke, felt heat scorch his skin, and understood something with terrifying clarity. No one was coming to save them. If this aircraft survived, it would be because of what he did next. And for the first time in his life, quitting wasn't an option. The fire was alive. It crawled along the metal walls like something hunting oxygen, feeding on fuel, wiring, insulation, anything it could reach. Smoke swallowed the narrow fuselage. Turning breath into pain, every inhale burned. Every second felt borrowed. Maynard Smith didn't think about heroism. He didn't think about medals. He didn't even think about survival. He thought about the next 10 seconds. That was all the future he could afford. The tail gunner was still breathing. Barely. Blood soaked his uniform, pooling beneath him as the aircraft lurched through turbulence. Maynard dropped beside him, hands moving automatically, pressing cloth against wounds, tightening bandages with shaking fingers. He had learned this in training, half listening, half distracted. Now it mattered. Somewhere behind them, ammunition detonated with sharp cracks. Not gunfire was, uncontrolled explosions. Each one sent fragments screaming through the aircraft like invisible knives. The bomber shook again. Maynard looked toward the flames. If the fire reached the fuel tanks, there would be no crash, no emergency landing. Just a flash, then nothing. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and charged into the smoke. White foam sprayed wildly, cutting into the flames, buying seconds. Not minutes, seconds. The extinguisher ran dry faster than it should have. He dropped it and reached for another. Coughing, eyes burning, skin blistering under the heat. The intercom was dead. No orders, no voices. The cockpit might well have been another world. Up front, the pilots fought blind, unaware of how close they were to disappearing. Then the aircraft shuddered violently. Not flak, fighters. Maynard heard the distinct ripping sound of machine gun fire tearing into metal, tracer rounds. Stitched across the fuselage, the bomber was wounded, slow, and alone. Perfect prey. He sprinted to the left waist gun, shoved it into position, and fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. Shell casings clattered across the floor, bouncing toward the flames. He didn't aim with precision. There was no time. He fired to force space, to make the attackers hesitate. Then he ran. Back to the fire. Then back to the guns. Left side. Right side. Fire. Wounded man. Smoke. Heat. Gunfire. Again, and again, and again. Minutes blurred into something unrecognizable. The heat grew worse. Ammunition boxes began to explode outright. Rounds igniting, blasting shrapnel in every direction. Maynard grabbed the boxes with bare hands, pain exploding through his palms, and hurled them through jagged holes in the aircraft's skin. Each box thrown out was one less bomb, waiting to kill them all. Each pound removed made the aircraft just slightly easier to keep airborne. His uniform caught fire. He beat it out with his hands. When the extinguishers were gone, he used clothing, blankets, anything that could smother flames. When that failed, he used whatever liquid he had left. There was no dignity in survival, only necessity. German fighters circled, attacked, broke away, returned. They expected the bomber to fall. It should have. Every rule of physics and probability said it would. But it didn't. Inside, one man refused to let it. 90 minutes passed. Or maybe it was longer. Time had lost meaning. His hands were burned. His face blistered. His lungs screamed with every breath. But the fire no longer spread. The wounded gunner was still alive. The aircraft was still flying. Somehow, finally, the gunfire stopped. The fighters peeled away. Ahead, and seen through smoke and shattered glass, land appeared. The bomber crossed water. England. The pilots spotted a runway and lined up what could barely be. Cold an approach. Controls were sluggish. The aircraft responded like it was exhausted, like it wanted to lie down and die. The landing gear hit the ground. Metal screamed. The aircraft broke apart. When everything stopped moving, silence rushed in. Rescue crews ran toward the wreckage, expecting bodies instead. They found Maynard Smith standing amid twisted metal and ash, barely recognizable, still alive. So were the pilots. So was the tail gunner. The aircraft had been destroyed. The men inside had not. And in that moment, the story changed forever. The silence after the crash was heavier than the noise that came before it. For a few seconds, no one moved. Smoke drifted upward in slow, lazy spirals, as if the aircraft itself was exhaling its final breath. Twisted metal creaked and settled. Somewhere, fuel hissed as it leaked onto the runway. Maynard Smith stood in the wreckage and waited for his legs to give out. They didn't. His hands shook violently, not from fear anymore, but from exhaustion so deep it felt permanent. His uniform was burned through in places. His face was streaked with soot and dried blood. He didn't look like a survivor. He looked like evidence. Medics reached him first. They tried to guide him away from the wreck, but he resisted instinctively, turning back toward the broken fuselage as if something might still need him. Only when they told him the others were alive did he allow himself to be led away. The tail gunner was carried out on a stretcher, pale but breathing. The pilots climbed from the cockpit, stunned, faces unreadable. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply looked at the aircraft, then at the man who had somehow held it together long enough to bring it home. No one understood how, in the hours that followed. The story began to spread. Mechanics counted the damage. They stopped counting holes after the numbers became meaningless. Engineers shook their heads. Veterans who had seen dozens of aircraft fail under far less damage stared in disbelief. This bomber should not have crossed the channel. It should not have landed. It should not have saved anyone. Yet it had, because someone inside refused to let it die. By the next morning, officers were asking questions, statements were taken. Reports were written and rewritten as details emerged that sounded less believable each time they were repeated. One man, alone, fighting fire, enemy aircraft, and time itself on his first mission. The crew spoke carefully, not because they were exaggerating, but because the truth sounded exaggerated. The pilots were blunt. Without that staff sergeant, none of them would have returned. The man they hadn't wanted, the man they hadn't trusted, the man they believed would fail. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What reached higher command quickly, then higher still. The story traveled faster than the bomber ever had. Carried by disbelief and quiet admiration, the army needed stories like this, not polished heroes. Real ones, men who didn't look heroic, men who didn't behave like heroes, men who proved courage didn't require perfection, and so the machinery of recognition began to turn. Weeks later, photographers arrived, reporters followed, questions were asked, cameras flashed. Maynard Smith answered awkwardly, uncomfortable with a tension he hadn't earned in his own mind. He didn't talk about bravery. He talked about work, about doing what had to be done because there was no one else. That answer made the story even better. When word came that the highest civilian authority responsible for the war effort would personally present an award, the base prepared for a ceremony. Uniforms were pressed. Flags were raised. A platform was built. History was scheduled, and on the morning it was supposed to happen, Maynard Smith was missing. Officers searched the barracks, the flight line, the medical ward. No one had seen him. Confusion turned to irritation. Irritation turned to embarrassment. Finally, someone checked the kitchen. There he was, sleeves rolled up, hands dirty, standing over a crate of potatoes with a peeler in his hand. Punishment detail. He had returned late from leave. His commanding officer, unaware or unconcerned about the timing, had assigned him kitchen duty. Maynard hadn't argued. He hadn't explained. He hadn't mentioned medals or ceremonies. He was peeling potatoes. They pulled him out, cleaned him up, rushed him to the platform where cameras waited and dignitaries stood ready. The medal was placed round his neck while photographers captured the moment. The image traveled home. America saw a hero. Back on base, the reality was quieter. The attention faded. The war continued, and Maynard Smith returned to being Maynard Smith. He flew again. A few missions. Enough to prove he wasn't chasing glory. But the strain showed. The fire had ended, but something inside him hadn't cooled. Doctors called it exhaustion. We call it something else now. Eventually, he was grounded, and with no mission to focus him, old habits returned. The war moved on. Heroes are useful in wartime, but only for a moment. Once the story has been told and the cameras have left, the machine returns to its rhythm. Schedules matter again. Discipline matters again, and people are expected to be exactly who they were before the extraordinary moment happened. Maynard Smith never changed. The medal rested on his chest, heavy with meaning, but it didn't rewrite his personality. He was still late, still argumentative, still convinced that rules bent more easily for him than for others. The uniform didn't transform him, the honor didn't soften him, and patience wore thin. He began signing his letters with the initials of his decoration, a quiet reminder to anyone reading that he had done something no one else round him had done. He used his status when it suited him, skipped duties, took liberties, slept late, the same. Behavior that had followed him his entire life returned as soon as the fire was gone. The army tolerated it longer than it would have tolerated anyone else, but not forever. In December of 1944, something almost unthinkable happened. Maynard Smith, recipient of the nation's highest military honor, was reduced in rank, not quietly, not symbolically, officially. The system had no choice. Heroism is remembered, behavior is managed. The war ended soon after. Maynard Smith was sent home and discharged, in uniform. He was celebrated, parades, handshakes, speeches. His hometown welcomed him as a symbol of courage. A man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. They didn't know him the way, though. People around him did. Civilian life proved just as unstable as the one he had left behind. Businesses failed. Jobs came and went. Legal problems surfaced. Another marriage followed. This time to a woman he had met overseas. Children were born. Responsibilities accumulated. Consistency never did. He talked about the mission often, sometimes accurately, sometimes with additions that grew with time. That was part of him too, the need to be recognized, to be remembered on his own terms. But there was one thing he never denied. On that day, inside that burning aircraft, he had done what needed to be done. No excuses, no retreat, no one else, and that truth mattered more than everything else combined. Maynard Smith lived a long life after the war, not a peaceful one, not an orderly one, but a full one, marked by contradiction. When he died, he was buried among generals, presidents, and statesmen. A difficult man resting in hallowed ground. His story makes people uncomfortable, because we like our heroes clean, polished, agreeable, easy to admire. We want courage to come packaged with kindness, humility, and discipline. But reality doesn't work that way. Sometimes the person you trust the least is the only one left standing when everything collapses. Sometimes courage doesn't arrive with a speech. It arrives with smoke in your lungs and blood on your hands and no time to think about who you are supposed to be. Heroism doesn't care about reputation. It doesn't care about personality. It doesn't care about past failures. It only asks one question. What do you do when there is no one else? For 90 minutes in the sky. Maynard Smith answered that question without hesitation. The soldier nobody wanted to fly with. Saved everyone who flew with him. And when the moment passed, he went back to being exactly who he had always been. That doesn't erase what he did. It defines it. Because true heroism isn't about becoming a better person forever. Sometimes it's about becoming the right person for a single moment, and that moment is enough.